Later, in response to the murder of 4 white settlers, General Elijah Clark invaded Creek country and reportedly killed some 25 to 50 Muskogees. Still, Creek border patrols did commit hundreds of raids in the Oconee River Valley in the 1780s. And their motivation is ultimately more interesting than the exaggerations of the Georgia press. Now, as Claudio Sant and others have argued, each of the big treaties of the 1780s between Georgia and the Creeks were illegitimate because only a few Creek leaders signed them. And these illicit treaties catalyzed an emerging political conflict between Creeks. Alexander McGillivray, of course, represented one side. He led opposition to the treaties. And he represented a rising elite committed to the expansion of Euro-American trade, the accumulation of private property, and the establishment of a centralized, coercive government. Muskogee leaders like Hoboythlamiko and Neamiko signed the treaties, and they represented sort of more common rank-and-file Creeks. And they resisted the kinds of innovations that McGillivray and his allies were trying to introduce. However, this sort of internal political conflict can be overstated. In fact, some of those leaders who signed the treaties, including Hoboythlamiko, began to dispute those very same treaties only a few years after signing. They argued that Georgians were willfully misinterpreting the treaty terms, that Georgians were trespassing beyond the agreed-upon border. And so they, too, began to promote border patrols. So again, in view of these contested treaties, we should view the raids of the 1780s from the Creek perspective as border patrol through the confiscation of property. The overwhelming preponderance of raids resulted in theft, not bloodshed. And they focused geographically on the Oconee River Valley, demonstrating that what they saw as important was the borderland. Now, in the spring of 1787, following the Treaty of Shoulderbone Creek, border patrols dramatically increased the level of horse theft in the Oconee Valley. Now, for Creek men, stealing horses was an easy and a relatively safe way to protest white encroachment, to gain prestige as warriors, and to increase or augment their income, we'll say. It could improve their own financial situation. By the 1780s, after all, horses were integral to the Creek economy. Creeks depended on them for everything from travel and trade to hunting and warfare. While Georgians' rhetoric focused on the threat to their lives, and while episodes of violence tend to sort of excite the imagination of historians, the fact remains that horses were far more frequently the target of Muskogee raiders. Greene County settlers, for instance, reported over 160 raids between 1786 and 1790. Muskogees stole horses in 80% of those raids. Yet they committed only a dozen acts of violence. Greene County's location, right on the Oconee River, confirms this pattern of border patrol harassment through property confiscation. At that time, of course the boundaries have changed since then, but at that time, Greene County stretched along 60 miles of Oconee riverbank. And that encompassed the area where the Lower Creek Path crossed over the Oconee River. Because it was situated in this easily accessible border zone, Greene County made the perfect target for horse raids. So, one of the obvious questions you may be imagining is, why horses? So what? Horses, big deal. Well, it turns out that Horses were often a white family's most valuable movable property. And this contributed both to Creek's political motivations and their economic motivations. Depredations claims typically appraise horses at between $80 and $100, although particularly valuable horses could go $200, even higher. The cost of a single horse, one single horse, often surpassed the value of a dwelling house and all its contents put together. So, for example, in 1787, a Creek Border Patrol raided the Greene County home of William Furlow. And he reported that they burned his house, they burned his furniture, they burned all his outbuildings, they burned his flax crop. All that property together, $150. They also took 6 of his horses, valued together at $485. Examples like this suggest that Muskogee Border Patrols favored horses over other kinds of property, both because their white owners held them so dear and because Muskogees themselves found them so useful. Now, occasionally, Creek Border Patrols eschewed theft and simply destroyed the property of Oconee Valley settlers. As a system of border patrol, few actions could send a clearer message than destroying one's home. Burning the homes of squatters obviously held no economic value for Creek warriors. Yet driving settlers out of the valley was a political statement, an act of border patrolling, an act of border defense, from which one might gain war honors, gain prestige. In February of 1788, Creeks attacked the home of Oliver Porter in Greene County. And they simply drove off 20 head of cattle rather than rustling those cattle. They burned 2 of Porter's houses. They burned 400 bushels of corn. That same year, John Lang experienced a similar raid. He wrote that he had carried off and destroyed 3 dwelling houses, kitchen, furnishings, and a number of other buildings with a considerable quantity of household furniture, with a total value of around $300. These kinds of raids show that Muskogee Border Patrols targeted Oconee Valley settlements because of their location, rather than simply the potential spoils. Now, Georgians exaggerated the level of Creek violence in the 1780s, but clandestine theft and more aggressive destruction of property could easily escalate into bloodshed. On the rare occasions when Muskogee Border Patrols actually killed people, it seems to have resulted from botched raids in which Georgians pursue the Creek raiders to try to take back stolen property. But the resulting violence could be so vicious that it terrified Georgians, and it contributed to their exaggerations of Muskogee ferocity. The murder of Ezekiel McMichael is a good example of this phenomenon that I'm trying to describe. In May of 1787, John Lang had a slave stolen from his Greene County home. And this ultimately resulted in the grisly murder of Ezekiel McMichael, and that event terrified Georgians. John Long's neighbor, Ezekiel McMichael, reported the theft of the slave to his own family. And then he left their home, presumably trailing the Creek raiders. A short while later, the family heard the report of 3 guns. And obviously worried for Ezekiel's safety, John McMichael took out after him. What they found confirmed their worst suspicions, both about Ezekiel's fate and about the Creek Indians whom they despised. John told the justice of the peace that Ezekiel was found wantonly and barbarously murdered and scalped by the Indians. John Long was tracking those same Creek raiders at the same time. He followed their trail down to the Oconee River, and he testified to the ghastly proof of Ezekiel's murder. In one of the shot bags abandoned by the Indians was found 2 scalps, which was proved to be taken off the head of the deceased Ezekiel McMichael by putting the same scalps on his head. Now, this is sort of graphic language. It captures our attention. But again, what happens when we flip the frame? What happens when we look at this from the Muskogee perspective? From the Muskogee perspective, it actually looks like this Border Patrol was eager to avoid further violence. When they were discovered at the river's edge, the Creeks retreated so quickly that they abandoned their rifles, their ammunition, and the scalps themselves, which would have brought them war honors and prestige at home. So I would argue that the intensity of this kind of violence, rather than its frequency, seems to have inflamed white Georgians, leading to disproportionate reprisals. After Ezekiel McMichael's murder, the Georgia Gazette sensationalized those events. They declared that McMichael was scalped according to savage custom, and the Creek Indians have again renewed hostilities. The exaggerated fear of renewed hostilities led a local militia captain named Alexander to invade Creek country and kill 8 Muskogees. It's important to note that none of Alexander's victims had been involved in the McMichael murder. The Gazette likely panicked Georgians even further.